But as we've been saying since the beginning of the program, today marks exactly 6 months since the coronavirus pandemic and President Cyril Ramaphosa came about and declared a national disaster in South Africa. That was on the 15th of March. You'll remember that I think it was on the 26th of March that we saw that South Africa entered into a lockdown. But it was on this day 6 months ago that we went into a state of disaster. The announcement was made 10 days after the first case was reported in South Africa, which was followed by an initial gradual rise in confirmed infections, mostly imported through international travel. Government declared a national state of disaster and the country went down into level 5 lockdown subsequently on the 26th of March. To date, the cumulative number of confirmed coronavirus cases stands at 650,749. There have been 15,499 COVID-19 related deaths. Now, despite South Africa being praised by the World Health Organization for its success in limiting the spread of the coronavirus, lockdown has also seen rampant corruption in the procurement of PPE economic contractions and an ever-increasing unemployment level. To discuss this and a lot more, let's talk to political analyst Ongama Mtimka. Good to have you, Ongama. Thank you very, very much for joining us on the program.
Good morning to you and Sakina, Leanne there. Thanks for having me this morning.
Quite incredible when we think about it. 6 months ago, this is where we as South Africans sat by and watched our president declare a state of disaster in the country. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't think it would be too long, but look at us, 6 months down the line. I mean, just give us your views on that.
It's been quite interesting how we have related with executive authority, starting from the president and government throughout that period. And I wrote a piece right at the beginning from the few days where there was it just runs from me now. Before the lockdown, I think there was a declaration of an emergency, whatever the case may be. That what was quite interesting about that time is that in terms of state-society relations, we saw a desire almost for dictatorship, in other words. We needed a stronger president. We needed a president that could show the direction, that would come and save the country from a pending disaster. And when government started announcing lockdowns and these other measures, there was wide acclaim and general support, at least in the beginning. But as things began as the consequences of the lockdown began to hit both economically and socially, we started a huge debate in the country about how justified a longer lockdown was, and obviously that's when government started introducing the risk-adjusted strategy. If you note here, Leanne, there's been a symbiotic level of influence between society and government, where initially, society kind of imposed on the president how best to respond, but also society imposed back on the president how best to respond as consensus about the extent of the risks that faced us began to weaken. So it's been quite an interesting journey.
Yeah, it certainly has. I mean, I remember you bringing memories of that day, and I remember all these memes I would open up and you would see the president and everybody loving him and putting angel wings on him and halos. And it was like, look, he's saving us. This is so wonderful. And then suddenly things started changing and things started getting a little bit hair-raising. And here we are now seeing so much coming out of this time. And, obviously we'll go through it as much as we can during the course of this interview. But the first thing is the economy. And the economy has taken a massive hammering. We were warned, we knew this was going to happen, but the reality is that South Africa was already standing on the edge of a cliff. We just needed a little bit of a tap to fall over, and we've definitely fallen over. I mean, the numbers, GDP contraction, 51%, unemployment rate, 30.1%. Obviously, we can't blame it all on the lockdown, but there certainly has been a lot of it being added to this. But the impact on the economy and on the individual in the last 6 months. Talk us through this.
Indeedly, and a huge aspect of the GDP as well as the economic numbers, socioeconomic numbers that we've seen recently arises out of the measures taken by design or as an unintended consequence. And there's all consensus that the package that government set aside in order to deal with the matter in terms of stimulus packages was insufficient. So here's a debate that kind of has been out there. Is the extent to which the levels of lockdown that we saw in South Africa were justified on the basis of what we were facing? And people who are entering here talk on two levels. One, there was this whole debate about livelihoods and lives. Indeed, when you capitalist economies are used to pricing in pandemics and having them affect a certain sector of society, which is generally the poor and the working class. And by the way, what imported the disease in here was the global orientation of our economy, as well as what you would argue as the affluent members of society who are exposed to the global economy and live in this part of the South African economy that's globally oriented and sort of is first world. But the expectation was that because of the structure of healthcare, among other things, what you would have is that the working class and the poor would bear the brunt of the disease. So when we look at the numbers in hindsight, we must avoid the trap of being locked in capitalist interpretations only of what has mattered. So, for example, we don't know how much of the disease burden would have been there among poor and working class families in the country. And generally, Leanne, our instruments of tracking well-being, such as GDP, among others, are not as quick in tracing other aspects of life as they are in quantifying economic loss. So here we may be in a situation where even after lockdown and the rates of economic collapse that we have seen, we still are in a better position compared to a humanitarian catastrophe that we would have seen, which capitalism would have simply priced in and retain some level of profitability. While on the other hand, you would see perhaps what these projections that were made being a lot more real in poorer communities.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, let's try and get through one or two other issues. I mean, we had, looking over the time, there was also the very controversial issue with the ban on cigarettes, and that was something that was a big tussle. We talked to the ban on cigarettes, then it was the ban on alcohol, then alcohol was legalized, then it was banned again. Now we still see some restrictions on alcohol. Obviously, we're going to be hearing from the president sometime this week, whether it's tomorrow or the next day, we're not too sure as yet, and perhaps even more of it will be lightened on the sale of alcohol. But this is a big one, and people were just asking, what was behind, particularly the tobacco ban? And, was this all above board? What was your take on all of that?
So we wanted a strong man in the president. At the same time, a lot of people kind of despised it. In fact, nothing divided us as much as that tobacco and alcohol ban. So if you look on one level, you had a general level of happiness, because remember, there's only about 30% South Africans on average that drink. What makes our numbers huge is that those people who drink, in fact, drink a lot, and that pushes our numbers to very high up around the world. So I think that's similar to tobacco products. So what you saw was that society appreciated a president that they could see stood up to capital. At the same time, those that had vested interests were questioning how this created an illegal economy and allowed that economy to thrive in a way that made government lose taxes. You will remember that the divisions there went all the way up to cabinet.
Yeah.
Minister Mbweni, for example, preferring to receive the taxes rather than allow this illicit economy to flow. But what I want to highlight, Leanne, is again around state-society relationships. That generally in democracies, we want people are jealous about their freedom, and they don't want a paternalistic government, a government that intervenes even against the right of people to harm themselves, because there's the harm principle in freedom, that
Indeed.
people have got rights, including to harm themselves, as long as they didn't harm others. And
Absolutely.
that lasts.
And we still never got that scientific evidence that they kept on referring to about tobacco. So there was also that talk over the time about who was, as the saying goes, wearing the pants. Was it Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma or President Ramaphosa? We still don't know the answer to that one. What do you think? I mean, who really was actually pushing the buttons?
Sure. So in a country like ours, we don't have a prime minister, but the laws of the country have created, in fact, including the constitution, by the way. So if you look at the debate in the 1990s to the mid-2000s about the power of the Minister of Finance, that power came more by design rather than usurping the power of the president. If you look at the legislation around disasters also, the power is vested in the institution of the Minister of Defense. But that there's never confusion among members of cabinet as to who has ultimate authority. Because remember, while the Constitution gives emphasis to, in the area of finance, to the Minister of Finance, and in during times of disaster to the Minister of Cooperative Governance, it still is the same document that vests power on the president. What I think happened, though, I think people were exploiting the divisions of the ANC, and also I don't think government helped themselves when the president announced a potential an agreement which may have been made, which they rescinded, but not have the president come to announce how that decision was rescinded, but rather the minister. I think that created confusion more than a tug of war in cabinet, because it would be career limiting for President Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and in fact, I don't think it was characteristic of her too to usurp the power of the president. Indeed. When she knows that he's got the power to recall ministers.
Indeed, but he did say that the cigarettes were going to be unbanned, and then at the briefing that she gave, she said, no, they're not going to be unbanned, and that's where that all started. I have to wrap this interview. There's just too much to talk about, but I cannot possibly not touch on corruption, because that has unfortunately turned into the biggest thing to come out of this. I mean, we've been seeing the question marks over the 500 billion rand. Where is the 500 billion rand? All of these PPE tenders that have gone wrong, the government officials that have been, whether we talk to Kuselo Diko, whether we talk to Bandile Masuku, whether we talk to whoever it may be, Ace Magashule, saying there's nothing wrong with ANC officials getting some of these tenders and doing business. I mean, this surely has, in a way, damaged the party, or hasn't it? Do you think the voter is forgiving, or do you think that this has had an almost irreparable damage on the image of the ANC, the whole issue of corruption through PPE?
I think it drove the final nail on the perception on the brand, especially the crudeness of it at a time when there's a humanitarian crisis. So I doubt very much he's going to be able to recover from this. The president may personally have gained some positive sentiments throughout the lockdown, but what was a counter to that was this negative perceptions, which are justified on the basis of the evidence that came out. And we know that the wheels of justice are going to take long in order to turn the right way. So the party is going to continue to take a battering here, including, by the way, the president himself. So people it passed the buck ultimately to the president when it comes to at least the ability of the state to recoup some of these monies, and also ensure that justice is served. And this is against a backdrop, Leanne, where South Africans, their perceptions of levels of corruption in the country have been increasing with every year. And in fact, we are on the lower half in terms of performance around corruption in the country. So it's a concern. And I mean, some of the countries in Southern Africa, like Botswana, are ahead of us when it comes to perceptions among citizens as to how best the country is dealing with corruption.
All right, Ngama, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, as always, for your great views here. He's a political analyst, Ngama Mtinka, talking to us about the last 6 months that you and I have been in this national state of disaster. Also, almost 6 months since we've been in a lockdown. I find it so amusing when we always say that the wheels of justice turn very, very slowly. If you put a faster engine into a car, the wheels will turn faster, and that's a fact.